The walls had a life of their own. They were not just brick and mortar, they were the lungs of a city within a city, breathing the stale air of sickness, despair, and an unceasing, hollow hunger. The smell was a constant companion, a thick, wet scent of unwashed bodies, human waste, and the creeping mildew of crumbling buildings. It clung to Yael's worn coat, settled in her hair, and clung to her skin like a second shadow. Every day, the smell was the first thing she noticed and the last she remembered. Yael Wajda, at 21, was smaller than the person she used to be. The cold and a diet of thin soup had etched away her form, leaving her with a wiry, bent frame. Her large, dark eyes, often red-rimmed from sleepless nights and fear, peered out from behind thick, wire-rimmed glasses which sat askew on her thin nose. The world she saw was a blur of soft edges, but inside the ghetto, the blur was often a mercy. She was left-handed, her dominant hand surprisingly steady as she wrote in a cramped, hurried script on a clipboard. It was a small, distinguishing detail in a world where individuality was a forgotten luxury. Her work gave her a purpose. She moved through the narrow, overcrowded streets, a ghost among the ghostly figures, her clipboard and a small leather medical box her only companions. She was a sanitary inspector, a guise she had mastered to move freely and, more importantly, to smuggle the only hope left, medicine. The box was her most precious tool. The bottom was a false panel, a secret compartment she had carved herself. It was there, hidden beneath antiseptic wipes and rolls of gauze, that she kept the real currency of the ghetto. Vials of penicillin, packets of iodine, and a few precious bottles of disinfectant. Every step was a negotiation with the city. She weaved past the silent lines of people waiting for their meager rations, their faces a pale, desperate collage of sickness and exhaustion. The air was a symphony of coughs, a relentless percussion against the low hum of muffled whispers. It was a sound that told her the enemy was not just the soldiers on the street corners, but the silent, unseen tide of typhus sweeping through the population. She stopped at a small, dark alley off Noalipti Street, the chalk in her left hand, a small piece of stone that was both a weapon and a shield. With a quick, practiced motion, she drew a small, crude star on the wall of a collapsed building. A signal. It was here, in the shadows, that she met Tomasz. Tomasz Nowak was 25, a Polish smuggler from outside the walls. He was tall, his broad shoulders slightly stooped to blend in with the hunched posture of the ghetto residents. A spiderweb of scars on his cheek from a forgotten street brawl gave his face a hard, cynical edge. His blue eyes, cold and calculating, held no light, no empathy, only a shrewd pragmatism that grated against Yael's idealism. He emerged from the deeper shadows, a large sack slung over his shoulder. The sack was filled with turnips. "You're late," he said, his voice a low grumble. "The hunger gets worse with every minute I wait." Yael did not flinch. "I had to take the long route. The patrols are tighter near the main gate." Tomasz's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. "You take too many risks. A good smuggler doesn't take risks." He gestured toward her small medical box. "You're a healer, Yael, not a soldier." She looked at the sack of vegetables, a small fortune in this place. "And you are a mercenary, Tomasz. Where is it?" He reached into the sack and pulled out a small, heavy brick wrapped in cloth. It was the medicine she had ordered, the life-saving doses of antibiotics. He held it out to her, and she took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was calloused and rough. His touch was a reminder of a different world, the one on the other side of the walls. She looked past him, her eyes catching the pale, haunted face of a small girl pressed against a window. The girl's eyes were wide and hollow. It was the face of 1,000 children in this ghetto. It was the face of Hannah, a child she had met only once, but whose image since had haunted her every waking moment. The sight of that little girl solidified her purpose, her silent plea for help. She looked back at Tomas, her voice calm and firm. "We are more than what we get paid for." She put the brick of medicine inside her box, her movements quick and precise. The click of the false bottom closing was a small, satisfying sound, a tiny victory in a sea of defeat. Tomas watched her, a flicker of something she couldn't name. Was it respect? Pity? In the mind of this woman, she was fighting a war with gauze and a hollow box. And in this place, that was the greatest act of rebellion. She turned and walked back into the crowd, her small frame disappearing into the mass of human despair. But her purpose now stood tall. The chalk on the wall was not just a signal, it was a silent testament to a war being fought in the shadows, one chalk mark, one smuggled brick at a time. The air was no longer just heavy with the scent of decay. It was thin, sharp, and laden with the metallic tang of sickness. A new ghost walked the ghetto streets, more pervasive and silent than the armed patrols, the ghost of typhus. Yael could feel its presence in the rattling coughs that punctuated the silence of the night, in the high fevers she felt beneath her fingertips, and in the fevered, glassy eyes that stared at her from every corner. Her work as a sanitary inspector was no longer a simple act of smuggling. It was a desperate race against a tide she knew she could not stop. Her small bag, no matter how much she managed to fill it, was a single drop of water in an ocean of thirst. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a constant companion that whispered of the inevitability of this enemy reaching the ones she loved most. Every time she saw a child trembling with fever or a family shivering under thin blankets, she saw the faces of her own parents and younger brother. The thought alone was a raw, aching wound. She met Tomas that afternoon at the remnants of a once bustling market. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and the sound of hushed, panicked conversations. He was no longer a cynical mercenary, but a shadow of a man, his face gaunt from constant movement and risk. He had a contact for her, someone who could help her smuggle more than just a brick of medicine at a time. He told her she had to trust him, and for the first time, she did. Her desperation had replaced her caution, and his pragmatic approach was now a comfort. "There's a network," he said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the clamor of the streets. "Poles, Jews, people who believe in something other than just surviving." He explained the network in hushed tones, the details as fluid and intangible as the people he described. A woman in a bakery who left chalk marks on the door, a priest who used his church as a meeting point, a small underground school run in a cellar. Yael listened, her left hand gripping her clipboard until her knuckles turned white. It was a world she had only imagined, a collective will to resist that gave her fragmented mission a new, terrifying purpose. The next day she found herself in a crowded alley, its walls scarred with old posters and graffiti. A small girl sat alone, huddled against a damp brick wall. Her hair was a startling shade of blonde, and her eyes were a soft green, a stark and vibrant contrast to the gray and brown world around her. She was a child of a mixed family, and her vulnerability was a palpable presence in the alley. The child's name, she would learn later, was Hannah. Hannah looked up,
her face pale and pinched, but her green eyes held a fearless, almost defiant glint. She was not crying, she simply sat, a testament to a strength that should not exist in a body so small. Yael's heart twisted. This was not a nameless patient, a faceless victim. This was a single, solitary flame in the suffocating darkness, and Yael felt a sudden, fierce need to protect it. Her duty to her people, to her profession, to her own family, all converged in that single, desperate moment. Her fear of helplessness vanished, replaced by a terrible certainty. Her mission was no longer a general fight for survival, but a personal, unyielding promise to this one small, defiant girl.
The morning of July 22, 1942, did not begin with a sound, but with a sickening, profound silence. It was a stillness that was utterly foreign to the ghetto, which usually thrummed with the ceaseless rhythm of hunger and despair. The silence was soon broken by a new, more terrifying sound, the methodical, rhythmic beat of boots on pavement. The gross action Warsaw had begun. The world outside Yael's small apartment exploded into a deafening cacophony of shouting in German, women's screams, and the staccato report of gunshots. Fear, a cold metallic taste in her mouth, was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical presence that clung to her throat and tightened her chest. This was not a random act of violence. This was a coordinated, systematic roundup, a machine of death in motion. The purpose was clear: resettlement in the East, a phrase that, in the secret language of the ghetto, was code for extermination at Treblinka. Yael grabbed her medical bag, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She had to get to Hannah. The little girl's image, her defiant green eyes, was the only thing standing between Yael and a paralyzing terror. She found Tomas near a bombed-out building, his usual cynical calm replaced by a grim, focused energy. "They're taking them. Everyone," he said, his voice clipped and low. "The Umschlagplatz. The trains." They moved through the streets like shadows, a part of the panicked, swirling mass of humanity. Yael's thick glasses blurred the faces around her into a frantic wash of gray, making her feel as if she were in a nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the coppery scent of blood. They saw soldiers herding families into the trains, their faces contorted in a mixture of fear and disbelief. Yael watched a woman beg for a moment to get her child's blanket, only to be shoved with a rifle butt. They found Hannah in the cellar of the small illegal school, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the quiet, terrified whimpers of children. Hannah's blonde hair was a beacon in the gloom. When she saw Yael, she ran and buried her face in the nurse's coat. "Yael, they're taking my mother," Hannah said, her voice a small, desperate plea. "Please, don't let them take me." Yael knelt, pulling Hannah into a tight embrace. She felt the child's small, shaking body and knew in that moment that this was her sole mission. The medication she had smuggled now seemed useless, a fragile shield against an unstoppable storm. Tomas, watching from the doorway, made a decision. He would create a diversion, drawing the attention of the patrols. He would give Yael and the child a chance to run through the sewage tunnels, the escape route he had always told her about, the one she had thought she would never need to use. He looked at Yael, and for a fleeting moment, the coldness in his blue eyes vanished, replaced by a fierce, resolute loyalty. He gave her a hard nod. "Run," he said, his voice a low command, "and don't look back." Yael, with Hannah clinging to her, found a loose sewer grate covered in filth and stepped into the suffocating darkness below. The putrid smell of waste and the sloshing of the dirty water around their feet was the new reality. She heard Tomas's shouts from above, followed by the angry clamor of soldiers' voices. The sound of a single sharp gunshot echoed, a brutal punctuation to the chaos. Yael did not stop. She pushed forward, Hannah a weight against her, the chilling sound of that single sharp gunshot ringing in her ears, a constant, painful reminder of the price of dignity and the impossible choices of war. The world above had dissolved into chaos, but in the depths of the sewer tunnel, there was only the suffocating darkness and the echoing sound of a single, distant gunshot. The air was a thick, putrid mixture of human waste and stagnant water, a smell that crawled into Yael's nose and coated the back of her throat. It was the scent of a city dying from the inside out. Hannah's small body, a fragile weight in Yael's arms, was shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the raw, unadulterated terror of the world above. Yael held her close, her own mind a blur of pain. She had promised herself she would not look back, but the sound of that gunshot, so sharp, so definitive, was etched into her memory. It was the sound of Tomas's final, defiant act. It was the sound of a life so recently cynical and self-serving, now transformed by a moment of fierce loyalty, extinguished for her and for the child in her arms. They stumbled forward in the darkness, the foul water reaching Yael's knees with every step. Her glasses were fogged, useless in the murk. She felt the cold brick of the tunnel walls with her left hand, guiding them forward. It was a journey through a literal underworld, a hell beneath a hell. They walked for what felt like an eternity, past floating refuse and the cold, unmoving shapes that were once people, their faces pale in the gloom. Yael did not let herself think, did not allow the grief to take hold. Her only purpose was the child in her arms, her only reality, the next step in the cold, fetid water. When they finally emerged from a manhole on the Aryan side of the city, the night air, though still heavy with the stench of smoke and fear, was a blessed relief. The world was still there. The buildings stood, the streets were paved, and the distant hum of a city that was not a ghetto was a shock to her senses. But a part of her was gone forever. The loss of Tomas was not a simple sadness. It was a physical absence, a void where a cynical voice had been. He had died for them. The weight of his sacrifice settled on Yael's shoulders, a heavy, unyielding burden. Her purpose was no longer just about survival or healing. It was about honoring his memory. Driven by a new, more painful sense of urgency, she found the network Tomas had told her about, the one of ghosts who worked in the shadows. The baker with the chalk marks, the quiet priest, the clandestine teachers in their secret cellars. The grief was a fire in her belly, a cold, burning flame that drove her forward. She was no longer just Yael the nurse, the healer, the idealist. She had been forged in the fire of loss. She was Yael the survivor, carrying the ghost of a dead man and a fragile child on her journey. She sought out the leaders of the resistance, not with her clipboard and vials, but with a new, fierce resolve. She was ready to fight. She told them she was a nurse, a medic who knew the tunnels and the network, a woman who understood the geography of pain and the anatomy of a broken spirit. But she did not come with hope. She came with a quiet fury. The leaders, hardened by months of terror, saw something new in her eyes. They saw the vengeance of memory, the quiet determination to fight for dignity. She would not let the deaths of those she had lost, those like Tomas, be in vain. She would become a combat medic, a symbol of resistance. She was no longer a ghost. She was a new kind of rebel, driven not by a dream of victory, but by a desperate, honorable need to remember. She would fight for the ghosts of the ghetto, for the dignity of those who had been reduced to nothing, and for the promise of a future that she was no longer sure would ever come. But she would fight. She would fight. The rebellion did not begin with a roar. It began with a quiet, fierce defiance on April 19, 1943. For Yael, it was the sound of a pistol shot from a second-story window, a tiny spark in the crushing darkness, a sound so small and so impossible that for a moment she wondered if she had imagined it. She had not. The gunfire began a moment later, the cacophony of revolvers and Molotov cocktails against the systematic, merciless return fire of the German forces. This was not a battle for victory. They all knew it. There were no illusions of a miraculous escape or a glorious triumph. This was a battle for dignity, a final, unyielding scream against the silent, suffocating march of death. Yael, now a combat medic, moved through the burning streets, a small satchel of supplies slung over her shoulder. The air was no longer just foul, it was thick with the acrid scent of cordite and the choking smoke of burning buildings. The earth under her feet was warm, then hot from the fires raging just above their heads in the cellars and bunkers. She was a ghost again, but this time she was a ghost with a purpose. She moved with a terrible, graceful speed, her astigmatic eyes focusing on the bodies slumped against walls, the small, huddled groups of fighters with homemade weapons, and the desperate, defiant faces of the old and young alike. Her hands, once used to diagnose fevers, now deftly wrapped makeshift bandages and administered the precious morphine she carried. She was a witness to the final heart-wrenching acts of resistance, a silent observer of a people choosing how they would be remembered. She saw an old man, a scholar, whose face she had once seen in a cramped synagogue, raise a rusty pistol and fire at a tank, his shot swallowed by the sound of the machine. The revolt was an inferno. For days the fighting raged. The ghetto, the world that Yael had known and fought for, was being systematically erased. She witnessed the destruction of the great synagogue, a cloud of dust and rubble marking the end of the largest Jewish community in Europe. The fires consumed the last vestiges of hope, the last remnants of a once vibrant culture. The people, her people, were being extinguished by fire and bullet, their last acts of bravery a silent, agonizing testament to the human spirit. Yael's journey did not end in a blaze of glory. It ended in the stillness that followed the destruction. She survived, not because she was a hero, but because she was a ghost who had mastered the art of moving in the shadows. She emerged from the chaos, a single flame in a world of ash, carrying with her not a triumphant banner, but a burden, the weight of memory. She was a living testament to the impossible choices of war, the quiet sacrifices, and the unspoken heroism of people like Tomasz. Her narrative of her life had changed from a daily struggle to a sacred mission. She would carry the names and stories of the lost, just as Irena Sandler had, burying them not in a jar in a garden, but deep within her heart, a secret archive of forgotten souls. Her fight for survival had transformed into a fight for memory. The world had tried to erase them, to turn their lives into a forgotten footnote in a history of violence, but Yael would not let them. She was the final testament, the last living link to a time of unspeakable evil and silent, unyielding dignity. Her story would be the vengeance of memory, a whisper that would rise from the ashes of the ghetto, carrying the names of the brave and the lost, ensuring that their sacrifice, their dignity, and their humanity would never be forgotten.